Following on our tradition of a lot of Tomb King videos here lately, I want to touch on something that a lot of you guys have been asking me about is what is the difference between Tomb Kings and vampire counts, aside from obviously the themes underlying both, one being heavy Gothic, like Transylvania, Romanian style armies, and the other being very Egyptian, Ptolemaic, dynastic Egyptian themed armies within the Tomb Kings. So what kind of separates them on an army standpoint and a lore standpoint, all those kind of points. Let's, I guess, go with one big, huge distinguishing factor. The Tomb Kings are insanely old by comparison to the vampire counts. They were there at the pre-man, not like pre-man, and they're not like. We'll go into the big lore about how they exist, but they were there before like the tribes of men inhabited the majority of what is now the empire. Like they were pre that society is what I'm trying to say. The Tomb Kings at one time were all human, and depending on how you slice it, they're still kind of human in a certain way. The Tomb Kings also are very sentient. They're not these kind of they're soulless and they're undead obviously, but they're not all bound to the will of a vampire like for the vampire counts. In fact, the very first vampire count was at one time a Tomb King. So you've got that too. Like not all Tomb Kings are vampire counts, but the original vampire count was a Tomb King. That kind of like if then that type of statement. But the vampire counts, as we know from at least Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, we know them to have one very large presence on the battlefield. They're vampire. And that vampire kind of sets the pace for their entire army. You've got Manfred von Karstein summoning up these droves and droves and droves of undead. You know, got Helm Gorst. You've got Kemmler summoning up Krell himself. You've got all these flavorful characters who really are the linchpin of the entire army. And the vampire counts don't have a ton of very large monstrous creatures. They've got their crypt horrors, which are larger. They've got their Vargulfs, which are a bit bigger as well. And then they've also got their Terrorgeists. In tabletop, the Terrorgeist and the Vargulf are actually the same box. You can make one or the other. The Vargulf is actually about the size of a Terrorgeist in the tabletop. But that is it for as far as their monstrous creatures go. And on top of it, they don't have any archers at all. They're very rudimentary. They've got their zombies, they've got their ghouls, they've got their skeletons, and obviously all those things are shackled to the will of the vampire at the time, or their leading vampire, and they're summoned up from wherever. There's no kind of honor, there's no mismatch, it's all mismatched. There's no actual kind of cohesion behind the army. Now, with the Tomb Kings, it's very different. Each Tomb King still retains the kingdom that he had in life. The Tomb Kings in general were put into their pyramids by the mortuary cult. The mortuary cult said, hey, we're going to imbue, as all the Lich priests said, we're going to put all these incantations on you before you die. And then when you do die, we're going to do all these other incantations. And a lot of your army has sworn an oath to you that they're going to serve you even unto death. And they're going to be buried with you in your pyramid. So the mortuary cult more or less tricks. It's not necessarily that they tricked, it's more like Nagash tricked the mortuary cult, but kind of misinforms, I guess you could say, the Tomb Kings at the time. And they're all buried and become these mummies. And there's a bunch of different, depending on what you're reading, there's a bunch of different ways you can look at this. So there's this one book called the Liber Necris that came out some time ago, and it actually goes into all of the different kind of states of being, or how a living being is divided up. And there's 7 distinct parts. There's the body, there's your actual shadow, there's the magic, your connection to magic, your ego and the abstract thought behind it. There's also like your actual true name, and then your conscience. And every single undead being and living being has portions of these distinct parts. Like for instance, zombies just have Ka, which is their body, Kabit, and also Sekhem, like magic. They're instilled with magic, but they don't have a mind. They don't have any kind of volition from their previous life. Skeletons, though, they have their they're Ka, Ka, whereas Kha is body, Ka is ego, like their ability to reason. And that's why Tomb Kings have archers. They have that ability to reason, to say, okay, I'm going to aim over here, this trajectory, loose my arrow. So they have these skeletons that have a little bit more behind them because they remember some aspects of their former life. And because their military was buried more or less like paupers, didn't get the grand ceremony of the kings. They were kind of just thrown more or less into graves. So even when they were risen back from the grand spell that Nagash casts, they come back with a shred of their human self, but not much. It's not like they're walking around like walking, talking skeletons, like bartering at bazaars. That's not the way things fucking work. But they're still, in a way, they're still dedicated to their king, and they still hold the same volition they had as a human. They're sentient in the sense that they can make their own decisions. They always are working in the behest of their king. Then you also deal with a lot of golem constructs in the Tomb King army. They have these giant war sphinxes that are these constructs of both magic and stone. They've got these tomb scorpions aren't necessarily anything like that, but they've got these ushabti, which are these giant, I guess you can say almost like a very large giant skeleton men. And then you've also got these necrosphinx as well. Even their knights, their cavalry are on these the necropolis knights are on these necroserpents. So everything about their army is way more standardized and more of an empire kind of approach to warfare, where you've got your cavalry, you've got your spearmen, you've got some archers, you've got chariots, you've got your cav, you've got your beasts, you've got not trebuchets, but you've got siege engines, you have actual catapults with the Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings has again, very regular standard army style, whereas the vampire counts are all shackled to the will of their parent vampire. And the actual Tomb King themselves, let's take Cetra for example, all the Tomb Kings serve Cetra, whereas in the vampire counts arena, whoever summons up that undead, the undead serves them without like reason or capability. They just respond to the ebb and flow and whim of the actual vampire itself. So you actually have a literal undead kingdom here, lorded over by actual kings. And here's another important distinctive factor here. The vampire counts can summon up undead from wherever, right? You use raise dead, you pop it, and oh man, out pops a skeleton, or out skeletons, or out pops zombies, or out pops ghouls, depending on your lord. In the Tomb Kings, you cannot summon new undead. The Tomb Kings are only the Tomb Kings that were, the Tomb people that were cursed initially. Those are the only ones that can be summoned back to life. They do get summoned back to life, but there's no, if you entered into a battlefield with 1,000 Tomb King soldiers, you exited that battlefield the same amount because you just resurrected your own. If you entered into the battlefield with 1,000 vampire count soldiers, you left that battlefield with as many as you wanted to create during that time frame. So that's an important distinguishing factor here, is that even the lore of Nakara is geared towards enhancing and resurrecting existing models more so than creating new ones. So again, Tomb Kings are very standard, and just like we see with the lore of life, you're not outright raising new people out of nowhere. You're healing and mending the ones that already exist. So you don't create stuff out of nothing with the Tomb Kings. And it's pretty important because again, we're going on those kind of 7 parts of being. We've got vampires themselves, and vampires themselves, they miss their shadow. They don't have their shadow, and that's one part of being a being, I guess, in the Liber Necris. And that's kind of goes on the typical folklore, I guess you could say, of vampires having no reflection, no shadows, and stuff like that. And Tomb Kings also don't need to worry about being in the sun. That's always kind of hit or miss with the lore of vampire counts being in the sun and whatnot. But the vampire counts themselves have to drink blood because they do not have also the connection to Sekhem, or magic, the magical connection to the winds of magic. They can sure control the winds of magic, and if they don't consume blood, the winds of magic kind of twist and contort them. That's why you have the Necharchs, who are these beings who willingly don't drink blood at regular intervals to have the winds of magic darkly corrupt them and fill them with magic. Or you've got the Strigoi vampires, Strigoi ghoul kings, who eat tainted blood. It gives them a tainted connection to Second, which turns them bestial and feral. So all sorts of these different states of being or parts of being kind of play into this. And since the Tomb Kings are essentially glorified mummies, they have, for the most part, every piece of their what the hell is it called? Every piece of their humanity, for the most part, minus like emotion, more or less. And this requires that you have pre and post death kind of incantations and enchantments on the mummy and the tomb. So that's why you've got such a diversity between these two. It technically, you still have the crumbling mechanic from vampire counts that you do in the Tomb Kings, but it's not because oh, your vampire dies, the army's starting to crumble away. That's how it happens in vampire counts. In Tomb Kings, if Cetra were to die, the whole army doesn't go, oh, we're crumbling away. It's just part of the way that the morale actually works itself out, because undead don't just, tuck tail and run. So they do keep that crumbling mechanic, but it is just interpreted a little bit different of a way in Tomb Kings than it is for vampire counts, because they're not tethered to the will of that lord in the literal sense. They're tethered to that lord in the servitude sense. They willingly have chosen this path for themselves. So hopefully this gives you guys a little bit of an insight into what is that difference between Tomb Kings and vampire counts. Why are they even different armies, aside from their general theme? Hopefully this gives you guys a really good idea of how that works out. But if you do have any questions about it, or any instances you're wondering, hey, when does this come into effect over that? Or, why is it that all of the Tomb Kings have this autonomy? And a lot of that autonomy is born because Nagash didn't intend for them to, his ultimate goal is for them to serve him, but it just did not pan out the way he wanted it to. And it panned out perfectly the way he wanted it to with the vampires. And a lot of the vampires actually answer his beck and call, especially in the early history of vampiredom. They all serve him until he gets defeated, and they're like, oh, nope. And they just kind of scatter the seven winds. But if you do guys have any more other questions, guys, like I said, just go ahead and let me know below. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, and take care.